Welcome, everyone. My name is Natalie Abel with iNACOL, and I welcome you to iNACOL's July Leadership Webinar. My clock here says 2 p.m. Eastern, so we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm sure some more people will be trickling in here in the coming minutes. But today we are going to be discussing research and approaches to expand the definition of student success. So I'm grateful to have Richard from Transforming Education and Adam from Summit Public Schools discussing this topic with us today. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. In the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a chat box. I encourage you to please introduce yourself. Say who you are, where you're from, what you do, what you're hoping to learn today, and any initial questions you might have. And also throughout the webinar, I encourage you to ask questions here, and we'll be sure to answer them at the end during Q&A. Today's webinar will be recorded and archived on the inacol.org website. Once we get that archive link, we will send you all an email so you can refer back to it at any time. And with that, I don't want to take up too much time here talking, so I will turn it over now to Richard to start today's webinar. So Richard, turning it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I will get started, and as you mentioned, if you have questions, we'll have time at the end to answer those, but we'll be keeping track of them as well. I have a lot of slides. I'm not sure I'll get through all of them, but there's a lot of things going on around SEL in the country that's really exciting. So I try to fit in the most important parts, but I probably try to put in a little too much. So we'll see how it goes. But again, feel free to ask questions, and we'll track those for the end. So what I really wanted to look at is looking at the research practice and policy implications of measuring student social-emotional skills. I probably won't get too much into the policy, and I'll get a little bit into the research and practice. My role at Transform Ed is Director of District Partnerships. I typically, when I present on this material, I'm typically co-presenting with our Director of Research and Assessment, so there might be some detailed research questions that you have that I may have to get back to you on, but most of the material that I'm presenting on, I've been a part of. So with that in mind, I'll get started. So today what we want to do is kind of look a little bit about who we are at Transform Ed, why we believe measuring social and emotional competencies is important, what types of measures exist, specifically looking at the core districts and how they're assessing student social and emotional skills. And then, a little bit about what we know about the validity and reliability of the core survey measures. A little bit on what's happening on the ground, and just a few comments on our approach at Transform Ed. When we work with districts and schools, we typically use the networked improvement community approach along with the principles of improvement science. So I'll just touch on those a little bit. So at Transform Ed, we support school systems in assessing and developing student social emotional skills. And these are the intrapersonal and interpersonal skills that students need to succeed in college, career, and life. And we do this by basically bridging the gap between the world of education, psychology, and neuroscience research with the world of education policy and practice. We work closely with school systems that basically want to act on this research now to serve their students more effectively. And we're fortunate to be the advisors to education systems that serve over 1 million students throughout the U.S. To do that, we work with an amazing set of researchers around the country through our advisory board, which also includes Marty West at Harvard, and we have partnerships with other organizations as well. So the broad range of perspectives from our advisory board and the partnerships that we have really are really crucial to the work that we do, because it enables us to look across multiple disciplines and identify relevant findings from many different researchers, and most importantly, to translate those findings into practical guidance for education systems. So the core districts are a group of 9 districts in California, and some of you may be familiar with this, but I'm going to just review it so we're all on the same page. So basically we're talking about 9 districts in California that serve 1 million students across 1,500 schools. And they've committed to working in partnership to improve student achievement. So together, 6 of these largest districts, including Los Angeles and San Francisco, have committed to measure students' social and emotional skills and school culture climate in addition to students' academic skills. And they did this initially with an NCLB waiver, but they're going to continue to do it under ESSA. So Transform Ed, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act. Transform Ed has been CORE's lead advisor on measuring social and emotional skills since CORE received this waiver back in August of 2013. So as I'll talk about, we basically help the CORE district select the competencies that they want to measure, curate a set of measures to assess each competency, and inform decisions on how to implement those surveys throughout the districts. So this gives you a little idea of how CORE's current accountability system works as a whole. So the superintendents from 6 of the CORE districts that I mentioned earlier basically joined together a few years ago to create a new definition of school quality and student success that looks beyond standardized test scores. So in this School Quality Improvement Index, they call it the SQI for short, if you look on the slide here, you'll see that academic outcomes count for 60%, and social and emotional skills and school climate and culture accounts for 40%. There are several indicators included in the social and emotional culture climate bucket, including data that schools are already collecting, right? And this includes chronic absenteeism and suspensions and expulsion rates. They are also breaking down the data by subgroup to identify and address instances of disparity and disproportionality. And they also decided to look at students' perceptions of the school climate and students' development of specific social and emotional skills. And collectively, you can see this is under the 40%. So a school that performs poorly on the 100-point index is paired with higher performing schools that provide mentorship and support. And this is important because really it alludes to the fact that CORE's accountability system focuses on capacity building and continuous improvement rather than the punitive consequences that traditional systems tend to employ. So once CORE committed to measuring students' social and emotional skills, the first task was really to prioritize, which of these competencies to measure. So CORE was committed to measuring the intrapersonal, which is how you regulate yourself, and the interpersonal, which is how you relate to others. And they also recognized that they couldn't measure everything they wanted to, so whatever they came up with would not be as comprehensive as they wanted initially. But it would be a good starting place if the research base became clear. So a filter that we use at Transform Ed when we help our partners determine which competencies that they want to select or appropriate to study is this 3 M's framework. So as you can see, the first M stands for meaningful, meaning that the competencies assessed are important for academic and life outcomes that we care about. The second M stands for measurable, meaning that chosen competencies must be able to be reliably and validly assessed. And the final M is malleable, meaning that there is preliminary evidence that schools can impact these through programs and interventions. And so this is sort of the filter that we use when we help partners. So along with the 3 M's framework, and along with input from educators across participating districts, CORE prioritized 4 specific social emotional competencies for inclusion in their School Quality Improvement Index that I mentioned before. And so the ones they focused on are listed here. Growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness. And I'll just pause for a minute so everyone can take a look at those definitions. Many of these, by the way, you're probably familiar with. I'm sure many of you have read Carol Dweck's work around growth mindset. So once these competencies were chosen, we basically needed to come up with the measures. So given that 1,500 schools were participating in this effort, CORE wanted to identify measures that were practical for administrators to scale. And this means basically that the surveys could be administered in 10 to 20 minutes, either online or on paper across a large number of schools. So we at Transform Ed went directly to the leading researchers in the field such as Camille Farrington, Carol Dweck, and Angela Duckworth, and basically to ask guidance around the kinds of assessments that core districts could use for free at scale. We ended up curating a set of survey-based measures that included both student self-reports and teacher reports. We curated both sets because teacher reports could be used with earlier grades, such as K through 4, where student reports are known to be less reliable. However, teacher reports could only be used for skills that are externally observable, which includes self-management and social awareness, but does not include growth mindset and self-efficacy. So obviously, if you're a teacher in any of these grades, you're going to have a good idea of each student's social awareness, at least from your interactions with them and the things that you've observed in their interactions with other students. You can comment on their self-management and their social awareness because those are external, right? But for a teacher to report on a student's growth mindset and self-efficacy, I'm sure they have opinions about it, but we didn't feel like that was going to be as valid or reliable as the other measures. And teacher reports can also be used in later grades to complement student reports. So I want to share with you an actual scale. So this scale is the self-management scale, which comes from the work of Angela Duckworth and her colleagues. It involves 9 questions, and it asks students to indicate how often they did the following things in the past 30 days, with response options that you can see at the bottom here that include almost never, once in a while, sometimes, often, and almost all the time. So you can see why these surveys aren't time-consuming. They don't actually take that long to do, which is great if you're talking about a large-scale assessment across schools. So I apologize, this slide is a little bit messed up here, but I just wanted to mention that even though it would be easy in theory for every student to say that they have perfect self-management skills, because of course people worry about gaming on these surveys, in practice we actually see a wide range of responses on these items. So here, what you can kind of see, we see the breakdown of student self-ratings on one item. During the past 30 days, I paid attention and resisted distractions. So it's hard to see on this, and I apologize again for the slide, but about 10% of students report that they're really struggling with this skill. And another quarter of students say they only manage to resist distractions sometimes. So this opens up an opportunity for a teacher to spend some time talking about specific strategies someone might use to try to improve the ability to resist distractions, or even doing some guided practice with students. So you could imagine that happening with all students, right? Or perhaps focusing in on one student who, by their own self-report, are really struggling with this skill. So once these measures were developed, CORE piloted, field tested, and rolled out these measures over the course of 3 years. They started with 9,000 student pilot in 2013 and 2014. Different forms of the scales were pilot tested to determine which set demonstrated the greatest validity and reliability. CORE rolled out a large-scale field test with nearly 500,000 students in the next year in 2014 and 2015. Importantly, because these surveys were given to 500,000 students during the field, we currently have a rich set of benchmarking data, which is good to know. We get requests for benchmark data all throughout the country now. This is the largest set of benchmark data on student social-emotional skills that exists currently. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to share with you some of the results from the field test. Right now, CORE districts are administrating the final set of measures to all students to include in the accountability index that I talked about earlier. This data will start to let us see what these measures look like when they're intended to be used for low stakes in an accountability system. So I'll just briefly go over these for anyone that might be interested. I just want to share with you what we've learned about the validity of the scores from the student surveys. This data comes from nearly 500,000 students, as I said before, who took part in CORE's 2015 field test. So I'll pause for a second for you to take a look at this. And note that the ratings on each measure are correlated in a positive direction with both academic outcomes, such as GPA and test scores, and in a negative direction with student behaviors, such as whether a student was suspended. In other words, students who had stronger social-emotional skills tended to have a higher GPA and test scores, and lower incidences of being suspended or missing from school, or missing any school. Importantly, these correlations hold across all subgroups, which is really interesting. Of course, this data doesn't tell us whether there's a causal correlation. So I am saving most questions till the end, but I did see that one person, Matthew Wicks, had asked if these surveys are conducted anonymously, or is the teacher able to see the responses of individual students? So right now in the districts in core, it's at the school level. So there's a lot of data at the school level that we can see, but the teachers aren't looking individually at students. But in some districts, they're doing a lot of innovative things to get a more focused idea of how each student is doing. So for example, San Francisco has just developed an SEL report card, and I'm going to talk about that if we have time at the end in the slides. And in that sense, they're getting on a regular basis, quarterly, a very focused idea of how these students are doing around each competency, and that's grades K through 5. So in addition to the validity of the surveys and resulting ratings, we also care about the reliability of the ratings. So I'm not going to go too deep into this, but as most of you probably know, reliability is typically assessed with Cronbach's alpha, which is a measure of the internal consistency of test items. So with standardized state assessments, we typically see reliability estimates between 0.9 and 0.8, and generally consider 0.7 to be a good rule of thumb. And as you can see on this slide, each measure meets the internal consistency threshold of 0.7, suggesting that the student surveys produce reliable scores. And again, these findings hold across subgroups. But perhaps more important, though, is how schools are using this data. And again, I'll talk a little bit about San Francisco, but on this slide, this is an example of the kind of data that schools are getting back after they administer the surveys. The report allows teachers and school leaders to learn more about their students' social-emotional skills, and also to explore the relationship between these skills and school demographics and academic outcomes. For example, in this report, educators can see the average growth mindset score and the average GPA score for each quartiles of the student's growth mindset score distribution. So to understand more of what a score of 3.72 out of 5 really means, right, does this suggest a strong or weak growth mindset? Teachers and school leaders can look at benchmark data that I talked about earlier to understand how their students' scores compare to that of other districts. So this is the last sort of like heavy data slide, but I wanted to bring this in because it's really interesting. CORE is looking at these data at the district level in order to differentiate the supports they provide for schools, right, which makes sense. So for example, this graph right here shows the relationship between school-level academic performance, specifically math scores on the x-axis, and the students' mesh skills, that is the SEL skills, the competencies we talked about earlier, are on the y-axis. So each individual dot represents a school, and the size of the dot represents the percentage of youth in poverty. On the whole, we see again that the students' social-emotional skills and their academic outcomes tend to travel in the same direction. But it's also really interesting when we look at the variation. For example, if you zero in on the schools in any particular range of academic performance, you'll notice that there's a wide variation in the SEL skills demonstrated by students in those schools. So here we see two schools are from the same district, the ones in this bar here, with similar levels of youth and poverty. Their math outcomes are similar, but they have striking differences in SEL skills. CORE's approach is built on the belief that these schools may need different types of supports. One hypothesis is that the SEL outcomes might be a leading indicator of academic progress, but we don't know that for sure until we have several more years of longitudinal data. One of the main interventions CORE is using is to pair higher performing schools with lower performing schools, as I mentioned earlier, so that they can offer mentorship and support. They're beginning to design these pairings not only with academic outcomes in mind, but also with a focus on the SEL skills. So the core example gives you a sense of how a number of large urban districts are approaching this work, but there are some limitations to the survey-based measures that are important to note. The evidence, of course, is still emerging, particularly with regard to stakes, whether it's high stakes or low stakes. There are some potential biases we have to think about. There's reference bias, there's social desirability bias, and there's stereotype threat. There are issues of equity. We need to ensure that these measures don't reinforce the cultural deficit model of blaming the student. We want to focus instead on giving educators the information they need to help each student improve his or her SEL skills. And focusing on social emotional skills outside of an accountability framework can help address some of these concerns. For example, in any system, it's possible to game the measures, but this becomes less likely and less concerning if the measures are used for formative purposes only. So there are many core lessons learned through this experiment. Because of time, I want to get going so I can show you a little bit about what San Francisco is doing. But I'll just give you a quick second to look over this slide. These are just some of the lessons learned from so far from the work they've been doing. And these aren't super surprising, right? I mean, you need district buy-in. That's critical. I think the fact that core started with I think the fact that this whole process really started with a group of superintendents is very telling, right? This wasn't a state-mandated activity or exercise. This is something that came from sort of bottom up, so to speak. So I have about 5 minutes or so. I just want to give you a quick idea of one of the things that's happening on the ground right now that I had mentioned earlier. So obviously there are numerous ways in which this approach in California has played out with SEL data. Of course, we know that schools and districts all around the country are implementing different programs and practices around social emotional learning. But in the core districts, again, it's a little different because they're heading towards a low-stakes accountability system. And during the last year, San Francisco formed a working group, which I'll bring you to, and we'll go back to the specifics of the report card. But I just want to mention how they did this. So they decided that they wanted a report card, and so they formed a working group, and this was comprised over 10 educators from various areas in the district. So, for example, they had a doctoral student who was focusing on executive functioning skills, some staff members from research planning and assessment. So I should say it originally started with 10 and then it grew. But as you can see, it was people from varying backgrounds. So they went through, when they decided to develop this report card, it's important to note that they went through several rounds of iterations. They gathered feedback from 60 teachers at 31 school sites, several family and parent groups. They focused mainly on getting these statements just right that we'll go over in a second. Lots of themes came up from the iterative feedback that they received from teachers and parents. For example, they initially had a lot of vague language and culturally biased statements that they removed and revised. One of the points of feedback they got was that the teachers wanted a guide, something that would give them an idea of what these what these SEL competencies are all about and how they might want to rate them. So what they basically decided to do was create a 1 to 2 page guide. Actually, the teacher guide is longer. I think it's 3 to 5 pages, and I don't think that's publicly available just yet, but it should be by this fall. And so this slide's a little bit hard to read, but this is just an example for grade 2. And what they basically decided to do, one of the things that the teacher requested was, let's not make the rating system complicated. Let's keep it very simple and easy to do because we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of other grades to think about. So they kept it to a 4-point scale. And what they did was they kept the same competencies that CORE has been using in the index that we talked about earlier. So social awareness, self-management, growth mindset, and self-efficacy. And these have become part of the standards in San Francisco. So this scale of 1 through 4 really is summarized best by saying that number 1 is not yet approaching the end of year standard, 2 is approaching it, 3 is meeting the standard, and 4, of course, is exceeding it. This is just a little bit of a closer look at the scale. So to give you an idea, and let me just make sure that I have the right slide here. Yeah, so just to give you a quick idea of an example, if you get a 1 in self-management in grade 3, that might mean that the student requires ongoing intensive support to complete tasks and transitions, and they need help maintaining focus and regulating emotions. A 3 for that same student might mean that the student independently and consistently uses strategies to regulate emotions, control impulses, and work independently with focus in order to complete tasks and transitions. So many of the descriptions for 1 through 4 are similar by grade level, but there are subtle differences. So when you look at the ratings for grade 3, for example, they're not very different, but they are different from grade 5, because the students developmentally, of course, are going to be at different points. So this is, again, a little bit more of a part of the teacher guide that we had to help teachers not only rate students around SEL, but also give them a number of different supports and practices, best practices, based on the research that we have, around things that might help them when they're dealing with students that might be weak in some of these areas. Also, one of the points of feedback I got was to create a family guide, and this really helps inform families in the community about what's going on with the report cards, right? What are these competencies all about? What does the research say about them? How are they being measured? And really, why are they important? And we're talking about San Francisco, and so San Francisco decided to translate this into 5 languages, as you can see. And so they have in other words, they have a pretty thorough or robust, I should say, plan for their rollout. So just a couple of things I want to note about the goals that they're hoping for with this. And I think these are really key to note. First, they really want to develop a shared vision within San Francisco for recognizing the critical importance of SEL for student success. They want to create a common language. I actually think this is probably one of the most important points because, as many of you probably know, within SEL, there are lots of different definitions, there are lots of different terms, and it can get not only confusing, well, it can get especially confusing when people are using them interchangeably or in different ways. SEL, just the acronym SEL can change. For example, at Transform Ed, we really refer to SEL as MESH, which is mindsets, essential skills, and habits. We like that acronym because we feel like it's a little more inclusive, but regardless, my point is that it's really important to develop a common language. Also to promote common best practices, and then also continue to make improvements on feedback. So I'm going to just take 1 minute and just mention that I'm not going to go through the rest of these slides because I'm starting to take up all my time, and my voice is probably starting to get a little annoying. But I just want to mention that when we partner with districts and schools and states, we really rely upon our networked improvement community model that Carnegie often talks about, along with the principles of improvement science. The kinds of things that we help districts and schools think about are, what competencies do they want to focus on, what kind of measurements do they want to use, how can they improve practice around this, and what kind of communication plan are they thinking about. So I'm just going to skip through these quickly, but improvement science, again, is something that we really focus on. And part of the thing that really grounds improvement science and practice is the PDSA cycle, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And basically hypothesizing, testing, and using data in very informal ways to monitor progress. And the networked improvement community, which is really just a way for districts to share best practices or schools in a networked way and build capacity. So lastly, I just want to provide a little bit of contact info. Our website is just transformingeducation.org. I tried to cover a lot in my section, probably a little too much, but I wanted to give you a good idea of some of the stuff that's going on and some of the stuff that we're working on. But please feel free to reach out to me via email, and I'll try to answer any additional questions. So I probably should turn it over now to Adam.
Thank you, Richard. That was really interesting, and I'm thankful to continue to learn from Transforming Ed and what you guys are doing. I'm always struck by how broad the data that you're able to collect are and across such a big network. I'm going to talk a little bit differently about maybe a depth of data across a much smaller network here at Summit Public Schools. So I'll just start with who we are and then move quickly into a little bit of practical applications that we're trying to explore this coming year across a network of schools. So first of all, Summit Public Schools is 11 schools. We're small. We're a CMO that is relatively slow growing. We're across 2 states, so Washington State and California. Everything that we do at Summit, we try to share more broadly as well, which I'll be able to talk about quickly. We were founded on a belief that diversity is important to making the best possible decisions, and so we only are greenlit, our board will only greenlight us to go into areas that have a high degree of socioeconomic and racial diversity. We do not track, and so we believe strongly in heterogeneous classrooms. We also have spent a lot of time getting clear on what college readiness really is. So 13 years ago when we began our first school, college readiness was about getting kids into college and making sure every student had the coursework they needed, for example, to even be ready for admissions to the University of California system, of which fewer than 50% of the students in the Redwood City area had the courses they needed to get into college, whereas at Summit 100% did. And so over the years we have about a 99%, 98, 99% college acceptance rate. What we found, however, was that even though students were getting in, they continued to struggle in college, and that really brought us to a place where we needed to create a more expansive definition of student readiness. So these are the values that guide us, and they came both from external research and internal cogitation. So we want to make sure that we're always connecting students' goals to their daily actions and behaviors. And while we've tried to do this for 13 years, we found that technology really is the only avenue that we currently have to allow students to actually break down their goals, make plans, and then act on those plans day to day. We used to have personalized learning plans that students created once a year with their families, and those lived in manila folders, but they weren't living documents. So this suggests that our data has to be very actionable and woven into the student experience. That's a value that you'll see throughout this presentation. We also want to make sure that we were really assessing what we value. And in terms of engaging students in deeper learning, it's very easy in many ways to tell students if they know something or do not know something. Much more challenging to make sure the kids are really engaged in deeper learning. And what we never wanted to do is create a network of schools or an academic model that emphasized what's easy to assess at the expense of what's important to learn. And so we needed to make sure that we didn't fall into this pedagogy of poverty that Haberman and others have spoken about. So we have to engage kids in deeper learning. You'll see then that we're trying to, and I'll show you some ways that we're practically looking at this. We're really trying to ensure that we are assessing the more complicated things to assess, and that data is actionable as well. We also want to make sure kids have the opportunity to fail a lot while they are within our doors. So what we mean partially about personalized learning is that kids have agency to make choices, good and bad choices, but they have the support to process those choices and see in a very rapid way what happens as a result of those choices. So we need students to have agency, to be self-directed learners, but we need to make sure that they have a common language, as Richard mentioned, a common language for understanding good and bad decision making, and to grow in their self-awareness. Finally, diversity is at the heart of our mission. I think it's easier to say we value diversity than to create a system in which diversity is possible without having superhero teachers. So another way that we're really trying to move forward, and something you'll see in our data, is that we have high expectations of our teachers and of our students, but heterogeneous classrooms as a system offer us a lot of advantages and we see them as a great asset to have heterogeneous classrooms. Most systems of education see them as a huge challenge to be overcome. And that's because it is challenging to meet the needs of a huge range of students within your classroom as a teacher. So we want to ensure that teachers have the right information about students so they can personalize instruction. I spent some time on these values because I hope that you'll see them play out through the way that we're approaching this one element of college readiness that we're looking at. So the element that I'm really going to focus on in this presentation is habits of success. So Richard did mention that common language is a challenge in this field, and so we're putting the stake in the ground of habits of success. Think of it as mesh skills, or mesh is more comfortable to you. These mean very similar things. I'll break it down a little bit because common language is so essential. The other three I'll just mention briefly. Cognitive skills are those project-based learning assignments in which teachers are facilitating learning through these projects, which are main course, not dessert, as Bucket Stu would say. We never want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so content knowledge acquisition still is important in our world, even when you can Google things. So we want to point students in the right places in terms of what they should be learning about and the knowledge they should be exercising in service of project-based learning. We also, through our content knowledge system, allow kids to make a lot of choices about what they learn, how they learn it, when they learn it. That's a presentation itself. I'm always happy to go into it. But finally, real-life experiences. We have 8 weeks of every school year in which kids are engaged in immersive experiences designed to engage their passions and change their perspectives. So these are anything from internships to organic gardening. There's health and wellness here, but there's also going and visiting college campuses. So our expeditionary experience allows 8 weeks of dedicated professional development for our teaching faculty, and at the same time offers 8 weeks of immersive expeditionary learning experiences for our kids. Habits of success, though, is the focus of this presentation, and I'm going to dive into some really practical applications of how we want to assess these habits across our network. First, it really is important to know that we are very heavily down the path of using technology in schools to help teachers facilitate learning with kids. So 4 years ago now, we hired our first engineer to translate those paper-based personalized learning plans where kids set goals and set daily plans to meet those goals, but which lived in manila folders, to translate that work into a system that gave kids access to projects, to content assessments, to all the materials they needed to learn at their own paces, and to offer us as a system, our teachers, our principals, access to information about where students were trying and failing, where they were trying and meeting success, so that we could better mentor and teach. From there, that one engineer developed this personalized learning plan. We now call it the Personalized Learning Platform. You can certainly click into it at the link that Natalie just shared. But inside that platform, which is continually evolving, you'll find a whole sequence of 6 to 12 projects to facilitate project-based learning, competency-based content progressions, features allowing self-directed learning to occur, and mentoring tools to support teachers in having the right interventions and conversations with their mentees. That's all in the platform. The platform is free, and fortunately, we've gotten the support of Facebook, and so we now have a team of almost 30 Facebook employees, primarily engineers and designers, who are supporting us in partnership in developing this platform and in giving it away for free to teachers and educators more broadly across the country. So I want to dive into then, in regards to this platform, how we're trying to assess what we value in the realm of habits of success, because this is a complicated place to assess, and we need to get clear on what's the language we're using, why are we assessing this particular thing, and how we're approaching that assessment. That'll take me to the end of this presentation. I'll just mention that the 5 buckets of habits of success that I'll be talking about are emotional intelligence. We're using that term still. Social emotional learning can be such an umbrella term that we used emotional intelligence simply because it's 2 words that people seem to understand. But we basically took the CASTLE framework there. self-directed learning. The research base behind this is Dweck and David Yeager and Chris Holloman. Learning strategies, which comes out of a lot of the CCSR work and Farrington. And then academic mindsets, which I think we're all pretty familiar with at this point. Obviously, school and classroom culture is very important. We need to hold ourselves accountable to allowing self-directed learning to occur by creating a culture in which failure is not punished but is rewarded with mentoring and support rather than punitive measures. So I'm not going to talk much about that, but we hold ourselves accountable there by a lot of perception surveys for kids. In terms of emotional intelligence, here's what we're talking about. This is straight up the CASEL CASEL framework. So we stole their framework, as we do everything we can that looks like the best stuff out there. We're not going to recreate any wheels. And then we tried to embed it in the personalized learning platform, which is accessible to teachers, educators, teams of teachers across the country now. So I can speak more to that at the end of this presentation. So the PLT, if you wanted to go in as a teacher and look at your kids, you'd be able to see a list of students. I could demo this, but I just wanted to put it in the slides to make it very simple for this presentation. So as a teacher, I go in, I see where my students are in terms of their cognitive skills average. That's from project-based learning. I can see their actual grades, which is a roll-up here. I can see if they have overdue projects, so if they submitted work. And then I can see in terms of focus areas how they're doing on content acquisition. How many have they passed? How many have they not yet passed but have attempted? What have they not even attempted yet? So as I go into that and look at my students, I can click then into Overview, select Emotional Intelligence, and I can ask my students to assess themselves on dimensions of emotional intelligence. This little box pops up and says, would you like then for kids to start this round with self-assessment? By the way, if you are at a school that is not using a lot of technology, everything I'm presenting here came out of a lot of pilots in which we used paper and pencil or in which we used Google Docs. So all of this started in super prototype phase and then has made its way into the platform. It takes a tremendous amount of time to get to the point in which you're ready to actually build a feature in. So I hope that you know that this can be useful to your network or to your classroom, even though what I'm presenting is on a platform. And if you're interested in more here, like this platform is free and accessible to you and your teachers. So the teacher has now requested self-assessments from their students. What a student then sees is that the teacher has now said, I would like for you to go ahead and assess yourself on these dimensions of emotional intelligence. And then it puts statements out there with a Likert scale and a comment box. So just 3 things that students do. These particular statements come straight from CASEL. We need to translate these still into more student-friendly language, but you can read those here as I talk. Students then assess themselves on the Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and then explain their assessment of their own emotional intelligence in this particular dimension. Teachers do the exact same for each student. So they'll do this 3 times per year for all of their mentees, and then they can opt into doing it with other students as well. I can get even more nitty-gritty than that if the questions want such a thing. So Samantha has now assessed herself blind. The teacher or mentor in this case is now assessing Samantha blind. Well, in other words, without a reference to Samantha's own assessments. Also has the ability to comment. This then generates a graph over time of how far off or not off are Samantha's and her mentors' perceptions of these dimensions of emotional intelligence. So here's the reason for this. We ran so many tests with different rubrics. The state of Illinois, for example, has a rubric for these dimensions that CASEL created around emotional intelligence and social emotional learning. And what we found is that getting everyone calibrated on that rubric was not even worth the time, ultimately. And that the conversation is what mattered. So what mattered is the teacher and Samantha sitting down and discussing their own perceptions of Samantha's emotional awareness in this case. And that conversation then was the important point, and the data was only there to help support whether or not this is this conversation, the quality of the conversation sort of is dictated by the data that was generated. What's also interesting, though, and Richard mentioned this, is that studies have shown that students who are more aligned with their teachers, in this case their mentors, often have higher grades in whatever system it is. So they're more academically successful the more aligned their perception of their emotional intelligence, in this case, but their work habits are with the perceptions of adults who are grading them. So we found the same to be true in our own very informal internal studies. So this is one of the conversations we want our mentors and students to have. You'll see then that at the bottom of this, you can barely see it, but it says, allow Samantha to see most recent session at the bottom left-hand corner of this pop-up box. Akeem, who's the teacher here, gets to look at this graph over time and thus is able to prepare for that conversation, have that conversation with Samantha, and then ultimately check that box after having that conversation so that she can also see this graph over time. The point is not punitive, and the point is not to, this graph is not the point. The point is the conversation that occurs between Akeem and Samantha. That is one dimension of habits of success that we are, and how we're approaching initially our assessment within a platform. Another dimension is self-directed learning. So the behaviors of self-directed learning you see here came from David Yeager. And with these behaviors and this sort of cycle of goal setting and reflection, we want students to really be thinking about their learning metacognitively as they make choices about what to learn, when to learn it, and how. So I'm going to skip pretty quickly through this, and I'm, again, happy to answer questions ultimately, but we ran a lot of internal tests around self-directed learning, and how should we be assessing this, knowing that we are prioritizing actionable data, and we have really deep data around how students are accessing our system. So the Personalized Learning Platform, or PLP, students are learning throughout the day on this system. They're making choices on it. We're able to see what their choices are in the process of learning. So instead of perception surveys or some other data capture here, the way we wanted to assess whether or not students are making good choices as they learn, and the choices they are making, is actually part and parcel of the way that they are learning. And because we have a data platform in which students are conducting a lot of that learning and making choices about their learning, we thought, why add an additional layer of data capture when we already have that information? Why not package it up in a way that allows us to understand better how students are approaching their learning within the system? And so we created a tremendous number of reports like this with SRI. So I'm going to talk very quickly about what this means. This is one of many, many, many studies in which we're trying to understand how we can move the needle on the way that students are learning and to allow them to become more self-directed. Because we want to intervene in the right place. We don't want to intervene around, do you know, colleges of World War II, when the real problem is that students don't feel like they have a sense of academic belonging, or they don't feel like they understand how to access the right resources. So this is just one quick example from this past year's data analysis around self-directed learning. We wanted to know, in terms of our low prior knowledge students, as based on the NWEA MAP assessment, versus high prior knowledge students, how are they interacting with the learning resources that we offer them as part of our PLP, Personalized Learning Platform? What we found is that students with high prior knowledge didn't just take a bunch of assessments. They took some assessments, which they can take on demand. They're able to choose when to take these. But they actually took the assessment and then targeted their learning at resources in the places in which they needed the most support. So if there are 4 objectives on a playlist, we call them, and they've already shown through a diagnostic assessment that they've mastered 2 of them, but need to work on the other 2, they would then dive into the resources in those 2 they did not yet master. We saw with low prior knowledge students, and you can see this, they were attempting to game the system. And I don't mean this in a purely negative way. I mean that they continued to take assessments without directing their learning towards learning resources. This is in September with 9th graders who are entering our schools for the first time. Most of our schools still start in the 9th grade. By February, in the same course, the same students, we saw actually that while in the beginning of the year, our low prior knowledge students, only 17% of the learning they were doing online was around learning resources, that by February, 48% of the time spent online was engaged in learning resources. So we saw a transformation in the way that they were approaching their learning and their self-directed nature of their learning between September and February. Now, of course, our next step is to understand better what were the moves we made that allowed that to happen, and what's going on with our high prior knowledge students, knowing that they spent about 50% of their time initially on learning resources, and then about 40% by February. This is, though, the kind of analysis that we're doing to help understand better student self-directed learning, and then to package that information up in a way that allows our mentors to have good conversations with kids. Learning strategies, the next dimension of habits of success to talk about. What we did is we took a number of learning strategies that grade schools actually was looking at. They had looked at it, of course, this is all such an incestuous little world. They took it from the CCSR work around learning strategies that were highest leverage, and I'm sure other sources as well, and then broke it down along these sort of clusters of learning strategies. After a bunch of internal tests, we decided that a way to do this is to batch learning strategies. And all I'll say about that is that the badging that we're talking about is around, can you do this strategy, and can you explain why, when, and how you would do this strategy, employ this strategy, I should say. So in a platform then, one way to do that would be a badge system. You can see that in the sort of middle right-hand side of this slide. You'll see learning badges. The 4 we're starting with this coming year are time management, study strategies, how to use a playlist, and note-taking. This particular student, you can see, has already gained the time management, study strategies, and how to use a playlist badges, and is now going to work on note-taking. Note-taking then is set up in this way. There's a number of things that the student will need to do to show that they can effectively take notes. The thing I'll mention is there's some resources here. We have a support system where teachers are helping guide students through this process so that they're making progress towards earning this note-taking badge. There's also authentic sort of natural consequences for having a badge. So in this case with note-taking, we might ask students who do not yet have this badge to show us notes or to explain their process of learning prior to taking a content assessment, which they can take when they choose. While we might not ask that same question to a student who has this badge, because they've already shown that they know not only how to take notes in different formats, but also when they would do it and why. So before they receive a badge, they not only have to show that they can take Cornell notes, they can take notes from a video. They need to write a reflection in which they demonstrate why they would take notes, how, at what time they might do it, at what time they might not, and when they would use one form of note-taking versus another. Of course, in the end, this will culminate in a mentor awarding a student this badge, which is shown to all of the adults in the community. That way we know how to best support kids and how to have the right conversations with them. The final thing that I'm going to mention then are academic mindsets, and then I think we'll have a little time for Q&A. The academic mindsets that we're talking about here are belonging, growth mindset, self-efficacy, and value. The trickiest thing that we found about trying to assess for mindset is that we've given lots of surveys. They've been useful. They're good points in time, but the more that we learn about academic mindsets, the more we realize that you're in a mindset. It's a state that you are in rather than a thing that you possess. So you don't have a growth mindset. You're in a growth mindset in a particular context. So we wanted to award or acknowledge at least that fact. Since students are learning in multiple contexts through this personalized learning platform, we have embedded at different points in their learning progression these pop-up questions around mindset. So here's just a very quick example. Students taking an assessment around global climate change, and they've just answered a question. This question pops up: how certain are you of this answer? We got this question from Angela Duckworth and Donald Comintz at the Character Lab. We said, what question would you start with if you wanted to start understanding students' mindsets within their learning context. They said this is a great one to start with, and it's already been tested. So again, we're not recreating any wheels here. And so we're starting here and collecting information across our network of schools. So the next thing I'll just mention then is here's our network of schools this past year. About 75% of the schools who joined us in the Basecamp program to pilot the use of this personalized learning platform are district schools across the country. Right now we're in the midst of what we're calling Basecamp Again training. And this year we're going to have actually about 20,000 students across the U.S. This is an old slide, about 20,000 students on the personalized learning platform from across the country. The demand was more than we had expected, and so we're trying to move pretty slowly, but even slow feels very fast, and that there were so many fantastic applicants to join us in using the personalized learning platform and banding together as teams of teachers who are trying to enact personalized learning that we ended up accepting more folks than we had expected this particular year. And so we're on our second round of training right now, actually, in Redwood City, California, where folks across the country are working together. The data captures that we have here on habits of success, much of it's around R&D. We're trying to figure out how students are accessing our system so that we can better support them and drive better and better conversations. And of course, the more diversity of contexts we have, which we can gather this deep information and work with teachers and principals across the country, the better suited we are to be able to build the right things into the platform ongoingly. I'll just say the last thing is that this platform is also available to individual teachers who want to pilot personalized learning in their own classrooms. So, so that's it. I think I need to turn it back over at this point to Natalie for some Q&A.
Thank you so very much, Richard and Adam. Adam, that's an interesting point to end on because we just had a question from Stacy asking for the name of the platform, which I think you answered for her. It's called Summit Basecamp. But she was also inquiring as to how she would go about getting that for her school. So if you can talk a little bit about that process, I think that would help her out.
Sure. So thank you for the question, Stacy. If you go to www.summitbasecamp.org, you'll find pretty much all the information you would need to know there. The thing that you might not find, however, yet is that within the next 2 weeks, we're going to sort of allow individual teachers to plan their own classes within the PLP, personalized learning platform. And they can choose, they'll have a lot of agency around what they want to sort of turn on and turn off in regards to the curriculum that is already pre-built, but they can ignore it all and build their own. But it's a free tool. It's best used in one-to-one environments. And you'll be able to find that information also on www.summitbasecamp.org.
Thank you very much, Adam. Now we'll transition over to Richard. We had a great question earlier whenever you were discussing the core districts. Matt Wicks asked if all of the core schools were traditional brick and mortar schools or if this encompassed any type of blended or online learning schools.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as far as whole schools, I mean, there are pockets of online learning, of course, in these districts, but by and large, they're brick and mortar. Having a little background in online learning myself, I and my colleagues are very interested in thinking about the implications for the stuff I just talked about and the work we're doing for online learning in K-12. And, you know, I think that conversation could go in a lot of different directions. If Matt, I don't know, Matt, if you are up for discussing more at length, definitely reach out to me. I'd love to answer more questions or get your thoughts on it. But yeah, but by and large, they're brick and mortar schools.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for Maria Worthen's last two-pointed question here. She's asking, we can open this up to both of you, what your thoughts are about using these non-cognitive indicators for the school quality indicator under ESSA, attaching stakes to SEL. And she also asked if you're engaging with the California State Board of Education as they draft their own ESSA accountability plan. And that's for either Richard or Adam, whoever wants to tackle that one.
I will very quickly answer that we are not thinking about accountability when, I know the door is open with ESSA. We actually believe that the habits of success data, social emotional learning data, is incredibly valuable for driving the right conversations and behaviors in our schools, but are not getting anywhere close to trying to hold teachers or our systems accountable based on this data. It doesn't, for lots of reasons. I would point you to the Yeager and Duckworth article, which I think is called Measurement Matters, that I think lays out a really nice blueprint for why we should not be doing statewide accountability measures using habits of success or social emotional learning at this point.
Yeah, I echo much of what Adam was saying. We kind of believe that accountability can mean many different things. The word accountability gets thrown out quite a bit, and usually when you think accountability, you think about punitive consequences, which we completely disagree with. We don't think these measures should ever be used, or at least not right now, in a high stakes accountability system. But when you look at some models, like the one that the core districts are using, in a low stakes accountability format, where there are no punitive consequences, and it's simply used as a way to pair schools with other schools, that we're a little more open to, and we think there's a lot of good evidence out there for these measures. But again, I think ESSA opens up, first of all, ESSA gives a lot of autonomy now, new autonomy, I'd say, from NCLB, to states, and to some extent districts as well. We're actually at Transform Ed, we're writing a policy brief right now to sort of outline a couple different pathways that states might want to consider. Accountability could be one route, but really just in general, we're advocating for that these be measured and used in a very sort of slow rollout and for formative purposes. So in many ways, Adam and I are on the same page, but we are a little bit open to these being in a low stakes accountability system. And if you look at what CORE's done, it's a very, very well thought out framework. But as he said, it's very early in the process, and we have to be careful, I think, about the decisions that we make with regard to the impact on educators.
Very interesting. And yes, as Maria mentioned, we'd love to see that paper whenever it's ready. But I think that's all the time we have for questions today. If anybody else has any other questions, you can feel free to email me, and I can connect you with either of the presenters today. I just put my contact information in the chat box. And as a reminder, we will be recording and archiving this webinar on the inacol.org website, and we will be sending out that link to you all within the next 24 to 48 hours. So with that, I thank our presenters, Adam and Richard, so very much for their time and sharing their expertise today. It was a wonderful webinar, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.